So if we consider this right here, the total amount that we're producing in the year, say that's 2,000 pounds an acre, all right? When do we usually put our animals out on that? When do we usually set our stocking rates? During the year. When do we usually do that? We set our stocking rates in July. We're setting our stocking rate before we put our animals out there, right? Okay, and we're basing it on what our typically is our long-term average production for the pasture unit we're putting. Is a lot of times what we're doing, right? Okay, so anyway, we come into a season, we're expecting 2,000 pounds of forage to be produced. What happens if we only get 1,500 pounds produced that season? We've already set our stocking rate, okay? But we're going to be 25% less in forage production for the year. We don't know it yet because the growing season hasn't occurred. But if we don't do anything to our animals and what we expect for our animal intake and our trampling and wastage portion that comes from that, we're already going to be overstocked by 33%. We're going to be out of balance already to start the season. So that's a situation that happens if we have a drought. Okay, maybe we have something else that occurs too. Maybe we have more grasshoppers that invade an area during the season. Now, we had that situation ourselves this year. We had an area that had just a ton of grasshopper pressure. Okay, so anyway, we're going to be talking about the situation here where we can make some adjustments during the growing season to find that balance again, so we're not in a forage imbalance with what is produced and what the animal needs. Okay, we want those plants to be resilient, be able to respond to their next disturbance. In order to do that, keeping this balance is going to keep those plants the most healthy in order to be able to respond. Okay. Dusty already talked some about the roots and root growth and defoliation, so I'm not really going to go over that anymore other than saying 50% line of defoliation. And once we go beyond that, more defoliation, we're going to stop root growth and above ground forage growth for that matter too. There's another aspect of take half of leaving 50% standing that we haven't really talked about. Dusty did mention it in that we can create our own drought situation. In that we have fewer roots there in order to take up soil volume and to extract water from that soil volume. But one of the things that we don't talk as much about is infiltration. Did mention it this morning. We talked about that buffalo grass blue rama sod and having water escaping the landscape rather than getting into the soil. Well, stocking rate is a big part of how much water we get to infiltrate into our soil profile. There was a 20-year stocking study at our research center in Hayes. They did 3 different stocking rates, a light, moderate, and a heavy stocking. And they kept track or did some measurements on how much water infiltrated into the soil in each of those stocking rates. And under the light stocking, almost 1.6 inches of precip per hour was able to infiltrate into the soil. Whereas in the heavy stocking rate, it was about 7,500 hundredths. So more than twice the amount of water was able to infiltrate into the soil in a pasture that was lightly stocked versus heavily stocked. So if you combine that with fewer roots in the profile to extract moisture, you definitely can create your own drought situation. So that's another reason why we look at stocking rate and try to utilize that 50% take half. Right. And Dusty did mention this too, that our rangeland yield is highly correlated with water year precipitation. The best correlation is with precipitation from October 1st to September of the following year, because that's basically the water going into the growing season and the water during the growing season. And at our Hayes Research Center, looking at 38 years of where we've been able to keep monthly precipitation data as well as pasture clippings for each year. 38 years of correlating those, we have a pretty good relationship between forage produced and the amount of forage or the amount of precipitation that falls during that. So forage produced and precipitation that falls. Now this R squared value down here, I mentioned during my talk out in the pasture that the closer that number is to 1, that means the better relationship there is between of the best fit line or regression line through all those data points. Each one of those data points is a year. And so the relationship is actually pretty good with water year and the forage that's produced. Okay. So that's going from October 1 to September. All right. But when we're talking about making adjustments to stocking, we can't wait until September when the growing season's done to make those adjustments. So even though this is a good relationship, it's not really one that we can necessarily work with in a dynamic concurrent basis through the growing season. What we can work with is we can work with precipitation that falls early in the year. So in looking at the information from our research center, I've broken it down into years when we have above average precipitation and years when we have below average precipitation on the left for April, May, and June rainfall. And basically what this is showing is that in years when we have below average precipitation, our R-square value or our fit is actually higher than what we had for our complete water year. That tells me that I can use those 3 months as an indicator to how much forage we're going to have at the end of the year. So that means I can use points during each of those months to be an indicator to me to expect how much forage I might have at the end of the growing season. So we can use those months to dynamically make decisions on whether or not we're going to be overstocked or whether the stocking rate we start with is going to be appropriate. Okay. Now, when we have above average precipitation in those years, that line really gets flat, doesn't it? That red dotted line. And the R-square value is 0.2, which tells me that there's almost no prediction there, almost no relationship. And you can see there's a lot of variation at that 10-inch mark. There's a lot of variation between our lowest yield and our highest yield. So why might our relationship go away when we get above average precip? Any idea why we might have more or less predictability?
Different factors can affect it.
What was that?
Factor affect it.
A different factor could affect it. That's very possible. That's something that could take place. There may be someone else in another meeting stated that maybe something else is a limiting factor, which that's what that would kind of be.
Sometimes the increase precipitation doesn't mean increase quality of forage.
Okay, that's true. Sometimes the increase in precipitation does not mean an increase in quality of forage. That's very true. In this case, we're talking about quantity. So we're talking about total production. What I think is happening when we have more rainfall, when we get above average rainfall during those months, it's likely that we're having events that have more precipitation in them at one time. And so maybe we're not capturing it all. So we're having more runoff. Or maybe that our soils get saturated enough when we get above average precip that when we do get some amounts that are maybe moderate, we're still getting some runoff. That it's not all going into the soil, so it's not all getting converted into forage. In a perfect world, this blue line would keep going straight on up, meaning every inch of water we got was going to directly correlate into more forage production. But that, in reality, that's not really what happens in our system. Okay. But this is telling me that those early months are very important, and I can use it as a predictor for how much forage we're going to have at the end of the season. Okay, so in western Kansas, we have an annual drought, a water year drought, one about every 5 years. And we have a flash drought, an April, May, June precipitation drought, one out of every 5.8 years. That's in looking at about 160 years of rainfall data at our research center. We're the official rainfall site for Hayes. We have about 160 years of data. Now, it's interesting that at Cottonwood Falls, there in the Fleet Hills, your flash drought for spring for April, May, June is actually more frequent than ours is here. It's less than one out of every 5 years. It's actually 4.5. And Dusty showed you this forage production curve or expected growth for Scott County here. By the end of June, we expect to have about 65% of our forage produced by now. So April, May, and June precipitation is very important because over half of our forage production will be done by the time the end of June gets here. And by the end of July, about 80% is going to be there. Should have been produced. So those early season precip periods are very important. So how important is winter precipitation? Is it very important for being able to predict how much forage we're going to have at the end of the season? Like when I showed you that good correlation of April, May, June precip, I think we'll get the same looking at winter precip. And looking at our Hayes information, it's actually no, it's not a very good predictor of how much forage we're going to have at the end of the year. What it does tell me is that in years above average winter precip, which are the red dots on the right, that the average of those is going to be higher. But predictability wise, to know exactly how much we're going to be above or what our actual end total is going to be at the end of the season, we can't really tell. It just tells us that our winter precip years where we have above average winter precip, the yield is going to be higher. But then the years when we have below average winter precip, we can't really predict, what that end yield is going to be. Now, if we take these years that were above average winter precip and we look at spring precipitation in those years again, so these are only years that had high winter precip. And we graph those, the correlation with R-square value is really high. We have a high predictability. Taking those above average winter precip years and still looking at them based on May and June precip, you still get a really good prediction of how much forage we have. So regardless of whether we have above average or below average winter precip, those early spring months are still our best tool to predict how much forage we're going to have at the end of the season. So I took all this winter precip data, growing season precip, early spring precip data, and looked at our forage production that we had in the research masters at Hayes, and made this flow chart, stocking, how to initially set our stocking rates on pasture to start the growing season, and then adjustments that we can make through the year. And based on all the information data that I collected, and Doug helped me put this together. But basically, it starts out with an assessment of the particular pasture at the end of a prior growing season to know whether that pasture was under stress or whether it without stress. Okay, because we know that based on the history of stalking range studies, that pastures that have higher utilization from the prior year, we can expect to be less productive in the next year if there's a history. Okay, so pastures that have a history of being utilized more, we can expect that there could be some slight reduction in production next year because of their higher use, right? So anyway, we look at the prior year, and it could be that we had a drought in the prior year, which means that forage stand would have been stressed. And we can expect that we could possibly have less forage production next year because those plants could have been utilized more if stocking wasn't adjusted, or they could have gone into dormancy earlier in the season where they wouldn't have been photosynthesizing and storing carbohydrates at the end of the year. So there's different reasons why a state can be stressed to start the next growing season. But in order to follow this flow chart, I'll start out with an assessment of prior year stress level or use level of pastures. And then you combine it with looking at what the winter precip is prior to turning. And you could adjust your stocking level. You could reduce initial stocking based on those two factors. And then you further look at your late spring, your spring moisture, April, May, June moisture, and where it was at compared to average or median precipitation, and do more stocking.